Christianity and the History of Science, uh, meeting number 2. Given the rapid rate at which I flung information at you last time, we're going to start with some review, but even before that, I have a biblical meditation for a moment. You thought there wasn't any Bible in this? Well, here we go. You remember Psalm 19:7, the law of the Lord is perfect, reviving the soul. You've probably read that many times, and every time you've interpreted it as the revealed moral law of God. Probably almost everybody that ever read it interpreted it that way. But I suggest we broaden it a little to include not only the moral law, but also the laws of nature. The laws of nature are God's glorious creation. And the fun thing about science is we get to discover some of them. Not perfectly, not completely, but it gives us another way to appreciate what our Creator has done. So the law of the Lord is not just morality, but also the orderliness of the natural world. And most atheists cling very tightly to one theological claim, which is there are laws of nature, laws of physics. Have you noticed? Nobody disbelieves that. And that's a theological claim, because if the universe is unexplainable, then there's no reason for it to have laws. With that in mind, let's review some of what I covered last time. We talked about common misconceptions about science, one of which is that science is a fixed body of knowledge that you can memorize. We talked about how everybody wants to stick to the same list of 9 planets, no matter what else is discovered. People got frustrated when COVID broke out that the doctors didn't just look in their science books and look up the cure for this virus that hadn't been discovered until just then, and so forth. The fact is, science is constantly growing and changing. Some of what we know will be disproven in the future. Now, I don't think a lot of it will. Science is not doing well if it's at great risk of being knocked all the way down. But new discoveries will be made. There will be adjustments. In many cases, what we know now will turn out to be only part of something bigger that was unexpected. Second misconception. It is widely thought and felt that science is hard to reconcile with Christian faith, that a scientific worldview is one with no religion in it. A little later tonight, we'll get into more of how that came to be, but the important thing to know is that some people on both sides, some scientists and some Christians, seem to have a stake in promoting it, but I'm not one of those. You've probably noticed not only scientists telling you you don't need religion, but Christians telling you you don't need science. Have you ever encountered that attitude? I've encountered way too much of it. Okay, a third misconception is that there's a fixed procedure called the scientific method, and if you follow it, you will get knowledge out of your raw data. So all you have to do is learn and then follow the scientific method, and you've got it. Well, there are fixed methods of work in narrow fields where there's a lot of data needing to be analyzed, and things like medical research, agricultural research, and a number of other fields in which there is a tremendous amount of new data being gathered. There are methods that people are taught so that they can all basically do the same experiment, the same analysis on different parts of this enormous sea of data. But there's not a single fixed method that fits all kinds of science at all times. Where are the controlled experiments in astronomy? Are you going to tell an astronomer that he's not a scientist because he doesn't do experiments the way you were taught for 8th grade science fair? Try getting an astronomy project into the 8th grade science fair, by the way. You'll find levels of judges that don't understand it. Um, I managed to do pretty well in 11th grade science fair with an astronomy project, but uh, it was definitely considered the weirdest thing they'd ever seen until it got up to state level and there were people who could make out what it was about. Every major advance of science has required creative insight and new methods of discovery. Okay, a major misconception that you have probably been taught since elementary school is that there was no science in the Middle Ages, that somehow at the end of ancient Greek times, science shut down, and there wasn't any until smart people like Copernicus and Galileo arose after the Middle Ages. Well, there was a lot of science in the Middle Ages, and a lot of it was deliberately forgotten and then dug up again by historians in the past few years. I named a few medieval scientists. I won't rehash the whole list here. These are not all the big scientists of the Middle Ages. I do need to add one more detail here. Roger Bacon not only probably gave us eyeglasses, but also gave us gunpowder, which admittedly he got from the Chinese. But the point is, he had the idea of looking for these chemical discoveries and seeing if there's something useful known in some other part of the world. I don't know how he heard about it from the Chinese. There wasn't exactly an open line of communication then. By the way, here is something I mentioned last time, and now I've found it and brought it in for show and tell. Remember I told you I had seen a diagram of an eclipse of the moon by William of Conches, who drew it around 1150 AD? Well, here it is. This is a manuscript that is in the University of Pennsylvania Library and is online. And it dates from only slightly later than William of Conches himself. And there's the sun, Sol, the earth, Terra, and there's the moon with the earth's shadow falling on it. And it is not quite to scale because the earth's shadow will actually cover the whole moon. So whoever drew this was a little sloppy, but the point is they thought about these things and understood them in the Middle Ages. This one doesn't make any claims about what orbits what. I had seen another copy of this where somebody put in orbits, so everything was going around the Earth, which is what they thought everything orbited around at that time. Notice how they saved their parchment by drawing the diagram and then just writing right up to the edges of it. Parchment was expensive. Paper wasn't invented yet, at least in Europe. Another common misconception about science, something you've probably been told many times, is that the church actively suppressed and discouraged science during the Middle Ages. Well, the church supported the universities. In the list of scientists I just showed you, 3 of them are canonized saints. One was venerated as a saint for a while in his own area, but didn't make the official list. One was a bishop and one was a pope. I don't think the church was stomping on these scientists very hard, was it? Now, being a Presbyterian, not a Catholic, I have no stake in defending everything the Catholic Church did, but they did a lot of good things for science, and they still do. I remember, well, I actually personally know the director of the Vatican Observatory, which is now 2 observatories, one in Italy, one in Arizona. It is Guy Consolmagno, who is American despite his Italian name, is the director of the Vatican Observatory. And when I met him, he was not yet that, but he was certainly doing a lot of astronomy teaching for the Jesuit order, which he belongs to. So the Vatican actually funds scientific research. Now, whether this is what they ought to be doing, I don't know. It does not bother me that the ECO Presbyterians do not fund an observatory, but still, what probably happened is they probably got an endowment for it centuries ago and have been keeping it going ever since. You've probably been told in your childhood that the church taught that the earth was flat, and people like Christopher Columbus and Ferdinand Magellan had to argue with the church in order to get permission to go across the ocean and then around the world. Not true. This is a hoax. This is a false story told by Robert Ingersoll in the 1890s. Educated people knew the earth was round since Greek times. Now, if your grandma didn't think the earth was round, we're talking about educational level, not about state of knowledge. Until shortly before our generation, most people were not highly educated. So ordinary people didn't know things that educated people did know. That is still the case, but it's at a different level now. You've probably been told the church in the Middle Ages and Renaissance routinely persecuted scientists. This is something I get all the time from non-believers. How can you be a Christian when the church has persecuted scientists so? Okay, what scientists did it persecute? Name me half a dozen of them, please. Conversation stopper, because I can only dredge up four, and at least one of them was not quite persecuted. Galileo obviously was treated very unfairly, and it's somewhat mysterious to everybody why he got treated so badly. People trying to reconstruct his trial and everything, they weren't following their own rules. They were mixed up. They weren't doing what they said they were doing. He must have simply annoyed some people, and personal grudges played a large role in what happened to him. Giordano Bruno was burned at the stake, which I do not advocate doing, but not exactly for being a scientist. He was into the occult as well. Copernicus wasn't persecuted. After Galileo drew attention to it, they put some limits on publication of his book. And 1,100 years earlier, a Greek female mathematician who was not a Christian was murdered by a Christian mob. But it's basically because they were having a war, not because, as was common during the collapse of the Roman Empire, not because she was a mathematician. It's still very sad, but that's about it. As far as persecuting scientists goes, there were misleading 19th century writers, Ingersoll, Draper, and White especially. Ingersoll was a popular promoter of atheism in the late 1800s. He was sort of the Ayn Rand of his day. He was a popular lecturer, very widely read. People tended to believe what he said even when it wasn't accurate about things like history. He came up with the Magellan story. Draper and White wrote history books that people relied on, not realizing how slanted they were. The big idea, the really big idea of this course is that science arises naturally out of a Judeo-Christian worldview. If we believe in a creator who made us in his image, meaning that he gave us some ability to appreciate his intellect and his righteousness, not fully, of course, but some ability to appreciate God's essential attributes, and he gave us permission to explore and utilize nature, and he created the world voluntarily, which means that we should ask what he in fact decided to do. We can't deduce it all from his perfect abstract perfection. We have to see what he actually chose to do. This is something that was noted by a non-Christian philosopher such as Alfred North Whitehead, and is now basically an acknowledged fact about the history of science, that whether or not you're a Christian, Christianity was a good framework for science to emerge out of. It wouldn't have worked so well if you were a mystic who says the spiritual is good, the physical is bad, let's not dirty our hands with the physical world. If you're an animist who believes the rocks and trees and planets and everything have spirits that might not want to be investigated, don't mess with Mother Nature. Mother Nature is the last vestige of animism in our culture, I think. Or if you're an atheist who has no real reason to suppose that we evolved to be able to understand anything. Evolution makes you able to get food and resist predators, and it doesn't particularly turn you into a philosopher. Let me run through the whole history of science very, very, very fast. Question there? We'll mostly do questions afterwards so they're not on the recording. Okay, yes. For the privacy of the people in the room, I don't want to include the questions session in the published video because we're publishing it for the entire world. But do save your questions. We'll have a good time discussing them at the end. Or is it a simple matter about a detail of what I said that needs clearing up? Oh, okay. We'll get to that then. Thank you very much. There was a lot of science in the ancient Greek world, not only Aristotle, who wrote a lot of things down, but Archimedes, who launched a lot of mathematics, Ptolemy, the astronomer, who calculated positions of planets accurately, and so forth. And then after the Middle Ages were largely a continuation and development of what Aristotle had done. In the 1500s to 1700s, we start getting some new things, experiments, not just relying on existing knowledge, but we're now past classifying what we already know, which was Aristotle's big task, and into discovering more. We are finding that mathematics is a powerful tool for understanding the universe around us, and we have more mathematics than we used to because people like Isaac Newton are discovering it. There is a move called atomism, which is we start thinking in terms of the things that we can see are made up of things we can't see. Cells in living things, atoms in chemicals, and so forth. So we start explaining what we can see in terms of smaller things we can't see. Now, this is the slide where I the very next slide is where I sort of left off prematurely last time. But in the 1800s, the big things were astronomy made the connection to physics. It began to be understood that the planets and stars are not a different kind of matter than what we have on Earth. Spectroscopy was one big thing for that. In biology, we had evolution. Darwin tried to explain the development of life in terms of natural selection and random variation. That made it a tiny bit less mysterious, but it was still very mysterious because it was not at all clear how heredity would even work. They didn't know anything about DNA. So that was a step. Evolution in biology was widely misunderstood even by its own proponents. And this is something we will get back to. Okay, here is the slide where I trailed off at the wrong point last time. I got as far as telling you about the Big Bang Theory, and I then didn't get to the actual points on this slide. The first one is one of the big things we have in the 20th century and later, especially the late 20th century, is statistical hypothesis testing. A lot of scientific experiments, especially if they are medical or biological or agricultural, have noisy data. That is, there is a lot of random variation in the thing you're measuring, a lot of variation caused by things other than what you're looking for. Suppose we wanted to know whether men or women are taller. I really regret we don't have Melody here for this because she's taller than average. But suppose we pick 2 men and 2 women, and one of the women is Melody, and the other is whoever here is the tallest lady, and then we pick the 2 shortest men. You'll get a misleading result, won't you? That is a small sample, not a random sample at all. If you pick 1,000 of each, you'll be on much more solid ground if you average their heights and try to judge which kind are taller. And the point of much of 20th century science is you can calculate the probability of a wrong result. This is called a significance level or a p-value. And the idea there is that you can calculate how much risk there is of getting a result that is wrong due to random variation in the sample. This is extremely important. Every medical research result you've ever heard has been through this kind of criterion, and they usually don't tell you about it. at least never makes the newspapers. But when you hear that something makes a significant difference, significant doesn't just mean somebody thinks it's important. Significant means, at least in Fisherian statistics, that the chance of an error due to random variation is less than 5%. There is now also Bayesian statistics, really 21st century statistics, that focuses on how to combine the results of several experiments that might be completely separate. So one of the biggest things that's new in science since the middle of the 20th century is a lot of use of statistics in handling data. The other thing that is a big concept coming up in science that's still sort of nebulous, but it does indicate a new way of thinking, is there is more and more concern with what Aristotle would call form as opposed to matter. That is, stored information in physical processes like DNA, the information stored in DNA that makes every cell of your body grow the right way and not grow into the wrong kind of cell. It's very analogous to software in computers. And software is something that basically has existed for about the same length of time I have. There was astonishingly little of it before the late 1950s, though there was some. And you actually have to go back to Aristotelian thinkers like Aquinas, in my opinion. This is my own tangent I'm going off on. People like Aquinas were better equipped to understand these things where form influences matter, or matter and form have an intricate relation, than the typical materialistic scientist of the middle 20th century, where everything's just matter. Okay, that's the review part. Now it gets weird. Sorry, it gets interesting. I want to introduce you to some terminology and some ideas for describing kinds of scientific thinking or aspects of scientific thinking. Included in this will be the logic of why conspiracy theories lead you to false beliefs. That's useful. And also an exhortation not to eat garbage, metaphorically speaking, and I will reveal in due course what that is about. Okay, here I want to define two terms that do come up regularly in our textbook, and in fact describe two substantially different ways of looking at reality that people almost never talk about. The terms are positivism and idealism. Now, both of these words are used in philosophy of science to mean something very different from anything you'd guess if you knew what they meant anywhere else. When we talk about idealism, we usually mean somebody who has high ideals, wants to make things better, and so forth. That's not this. When we talk about positivism, it almost sounds like we'd mean the same thing, somebody that wants to be positive about things or something. That's not this. Through a contorted history that frankly probably involves some people who are not very good at making up suitable terminology for their work, we are stuck with these words, positivism and idealism, and let me tell you what they mean when we're talking about scientific method. Positivism is the concept that the physical world is all that is real. The cosmos is all there ever is or ever will be. Ever heard those words? I believe Carl Sagan was a positivist. That was Sagan, wasn't it? Yes. Positivism is the idea that the physical world is the only thing that's real, and the task of science is to collect knowledge of the physical world. And it's strongly predominant since the 1930s. And some Christian apologists, including Nancy Pearcey, call this the one-story worldview, a one-level worldview where there is matter and nothing else. No second level for souls or minds or beauty or truth or logic or mathematics. Wait a minute, logic or mathematics? Okay, you can begin to smell a problem approaching here if you believe that physical matter is all that there is. Nonetheless, that's positivism, and why it's called that The French Enlightenment philosopher Auguste Comte, I think around 1800, is that right? I'm not sure. One of the encyclopédistes, tried to free science from religion. French Enlightenment people did that. Also free it from what he called metaphysics or needless abstract thinking, and only study what is out there. Latin positus, what is put there. Positus means put or placed in Latin. And so this was called positivism. You've encountered this kind of thinking. Now I've given it a name. There's an alternative. Idealism, and sorry, that's a badly chosen word. They pinned that word on it because they wanted something that started with idea and ended with ism. I think the L in there is misleading, but this is the ism of the idea. Idealism assumes the mind comes first. The thing that I am most sure of is that I have a mind and I have ideas. And the real question is how my mind finds out about the physical world. I'm more sure that I have a mind than that I have a hand. Think about that. I could conceivably be mistaken about having a hand. People after amputations sometimes are, when the nerves are still present for the part that's missing. But how could I be mistaken about whether I have a mind? Who's being mistaken then if it's not me? You see the appeal of idealism there. The question of science then is how my mind finds out about the outside world, and that means that when an idealist philosopher studies scientific method, the person doing the discovering really is a character in the story. This is about how people make discoveries. Idealism was quite popular until about 1930 and then just went away and was replaced by positivism, especially in Britain. The British philosophical tradition is the one I am most familiar with, most schooled in. And first serious philosophical book I ever read was Language, Truth, and Logic by A.J. Ayer, which is a defense of positivism. It didn't take me too long to think he was on the wrong track, but it was a very interesting and very clear book, and I think the appeal of positivism is there's less in it, so you can be clearer and more certain. Okay, let me reinforce now, positivism is the view that basically the material world is all that's real. Idealism is the view that the mind comes first, and we're interested in how the mind finds out about the material world. And if you're interested in history of science, you almost need to be an idealist, otherwise you have nothing to study. Let's let positivism and idealism soak in. The reason I've said so much about this strange topic is the terms keep coming up in the textbook, and you need to know what they mean. Okay? I now want to do something stranger, and I assure you this course will reach maximum weirdness during the next 15 minutes or so, and then it will get back on familiar ground. I want to introduce you to a theorem in logic. Well, not exactly a theorem, but a deduced result in logic called the Quine-Duhem thesis. And the Quine-Duhem thesis tells us why conspiracy theories are illogical or are not likely to produce true beliefs. Now, first of all, these funny names. This is the session for strange vocabulary, and these people's names are fairly strange. Duhem, whose first name I don't remember, was a French philosopher who studied scientific method. I think he was active in the early 1900s. He's also remembered for rediscovering medieval science. He gets mentioned a good bit in our textbook, and it's pronounced Duhem. I did look it up. French is one of these obstinate languages where no matter how much of it I learn, I am going to feel that there is still this vast ocean of mysterious pronunciation out there in front of me and things to look up in the dictionary. Other people feel that way about English. I happen to be speaking the hardest to pronounce language in the world, probably at the moment. I'm glad I was born into it. Anyway, Duhem was a French philosopher. Quine was a Harvard logician. He was also my thesis advisor's thesis advisor. I've studied with two people who studied with Quine, um, and he was active up through the 1950s and 60s at least, and they both arrived at this conclusion independently, which is why it's named after both of them, although for a long time I only knew that Quine had discovered it and I only was referring to it by his name. The insight, here is the thing they discovered. And this is basically undisputed. This is as solid as anything in logic can be. You can cling to any belief while ignoring any evidence if you are willing to make enough changes to your other beliefs. So it's common in science to do an experiment and find that your assumptions must be wrong because it didn't come out the way you expected, but you're not sure which assumption you need to change. Quine and Duhem say, don't go too far. Be restrained in changing your assumptions, or you'll go off into something wild. And let me explain that. The point is, if I wanted to believe that I did not have a right hand, I would have to believe that there are all sorts of strange illusions making me think making it look like I have a right hand. And that lots of other people have ganged up to tell me falsely that I have a right hand, and so forth. You see what happens? If I changed enough of my other beliefs, I could believe that I don't have a right hand, even though I plainly see it and feel it right here.
Birds don't exist.
Birds don't exist. Yes, the joke going around social media right now, do you believe in birds? Birds aren't real. It's all a great conspiracy. People are putting fake things up in the outside the windows to make it look like there are birds. Yes. So dwelling on the Quine-Duhem thesis a little more, the point for a working scientist is that pure logic does not tell you which of your assumptions to change. You have to seek other evidence and look at the big picture. So when you change your assumptions so that you can explain a failed experiment, are you questioning things that are really open to doubt so that you arrive at a big picture that makes more sense? Or are you just cluttering up your big picture with lots of arbitrary changes where you need more and more and more arbitrary changes and your understanding gets foggier, not clearer? That's what this means to a scientist, but it's also very important to ordinary people in real life. Sherlock Holmes was good at applying the Quine-Duhem thesis over and over. Something's unexplainable because it does not fit any of the facts, so some of the facts must be false, and Sherlock Holmes had good judgment for deciding which things to question, and that's how he solved cases. If you like classic detective stories, you like the Quine-Duhem thesis because that's basically what they are about. Hercule Poirot as well. Whoever your favorite detective story heroes are, there's that awful French language again. Okay, here's a more down-to-earth example. I should have used the birds don't exist joke, but suppose you don't want to believe that Watkinsville exists. Well, we're not in Watkinsville, are we? You look around you, you don't see Watkinsville. This is Athens, Georgia, not Watkinsville. There is a lot of evidence that Watkinsville does exist. You will certainly find people who even claim to live there. Is there anybody here who claims to live in Watkinsville? Okay. I don't live there myself, so I don't know whether to believe them. You will hear people talking about going to the big Publix in Watkinsville, people going to the art gallery in Watkinsville, all sorts of things. Now, if you want to ignore this evidence, you have to believe that an awful lot of people have organized an elaborate fake. I mean, here are people that claim to live in Watkinsville. They must be hoaxing me. What about the rest of you? You think you've been in Watkinsville. What about the GPS in my car that shows Watkinsville as a place I can drive to? And sure enough, I can drive and I get somewhere. Well, it must be fake. It must not be the real Watkinsville. I mean, suppose I were to go to London and look for an atlas of the United States that was published there, and there's Watkinsville even on that. Even the British are in on it. You can't claim the US government did this hoax. Suppose I could go to Russia and get a KGB map of this area, and even it has Watkinsville. Well, that's Putin and Biden must be both in on it. Hard to imagine them being both in on anything, but you see what it leads to. You have to make more and more wilder assumptions. Our understanding of Watkinsville or the alleged evidence for Watkinsville does not get clearer and make more sense when we do that. It makes less sense. We call it a conspiracy theory. Now, conspiracy theories are illogical because they require you to keep making changes to beliefs that are unrelated to the thing being questioned. And the changes never stop. There are always more. You can tell you've gone down the wrong road when the changes never stop. And in scientific research, this is actually a practical thing. If you have to keep making adjustment after adjustment to your assumptions, back up and throw out a different assumption instead. There's a smoother path, a shorter path somewhere. I need to explain, by the way, because this occasionally comes up in political arguments. When I say conspiracy theory here, I'm talking about a kind of logic. I don't mean a theory that there is a conspiracy. Sometimes there is a conspiracy. Watergate was a conspiracy. And there was a group of people scheming to do something deceptive. And so if you had a theory that Watergate was a conspiracy, you would have been correct if you came along at the right time. So this is what I mean by conspiracy theories. A conspiracy theory is usually the claim that an amazingly large number of people are all conspiring together to deceive the entire public about an obvious fact. Like people will say, the government's fooling us all. Well, what about other countries? How did our government get together with the government of maybe Iran, if it says the same thing or something like that? All the media, except the one I'm going to point you to, are deceiving you, right? Official proceedings, congressional record, court records, things you can see in a courtroom are all fake. They're all part of the conspiracy. People who claim to have been present at events. I know someone whose husband watched the January 6th uprising from across the street. I suppose if you believe it never happened. Or I know people who claim to watch birds. If you believe there are no birds, they must be in on it, right? Even though they're all over the world and not connected to each other. So at every difficulty, the solution is to have even more people be faking something. That's how a conspiracy theory works. That's what happens if you fall off the Quine Duhem thesis on entirely the wrong side and go for as wild a ride as you possibly could. But it has to do with science, because in science, we're always trying to figure out which of our previous beliefs, previous theories, ought to be adjusted or changed to accommodate new evidence. And the Quine Duhem thesis says basically, don't go wild, be strategic in what you change. I do want to offer a special caution for Christians here, because there are so many issues ranging from science to politics where we understand that the secular culture is pervasively mistaken about certain things. Now, that makes some Christians easy prey for anybody who claims to be rejecting mistakes made by the secular culture, whether or not what they have to offer is actually better. Adding an error to an error doesn't make truth. So you can often spot quacks of this type because they are not in fellowship with other Christians. So there is quackery even on the subject of the relation between science and Christianity. And people will use Christ's name to ask you to believe strange things. Another way I would sum this up is when the secular culture serves you a tainted meal, don't go eat out of the garbage can. Don't eat something worse. Instead, be well informed, weigh the evidence. And I want to conclude with this really, really important point. Healthy Christian faith is not a conspiracy theory. You should not be avoiding knowledge and making strange assumptions at the drop of every hat, if it makes sense to say at the drop of every hat. Every time you learn something, that should not require you to start avoiding knowledge and making strange assumptions. That's not the right way to use your mind. My experience is that the Christian faith is actually the convergence of many different sources of knowledge. It's the opposite of a conspiracy theory. It's actually where different things come together and make more sense together than they would apart. Why do I even have a mind? God can tell me. If I didn't believe in God, that question's unanswerable. Evolution can tell me why I have a stomach. That's not quite the same thing. Not quite as much fun, you know. And I'm reminded of what C.S. Lewis said. I know that God is real the way I know the sun has risen, not just because I see it, but also because by the light of it, I see everything else. I can pull together deep questions about the universe, about human nature, about what I am, about how I know things, and about how all the physical world got to be the way it is. And I don't understand it all, but it stands a chance of making sense. And in the mind of God, I think it does entirely make sense. And if I were simply collecting random beliefs, trying to cobble them together, it would not work that way.